Roll call, please.
Commissioner Denise McGriff.
Present.
Commissioner Rocky Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Stephen Haberbeck.
Here.
Commissioner Rachel Lyle Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Dan Holliday is here. And Chair Frank O'Donnell.
Here. Do we have any citizen comments this evening?
The mayor is not here unless he's in here, so let's make that clear.
We'll note when the mayor joins the meeting.
Yeah, it's good.
Do we have citizen comments?
No.
No citizen comments. We'll move on to general business. Item 4A, 19-520, which is an amendment, number 1, to the disposition and development agreement with the Cove LLC, presented by our city manager, Tony Conkle.
Thank you. Evening, commissioners. So tonight, we met last on August 21st. The commission requested that the developer, Mr. David Mooney, representing the Cove LLC, be present at one of the September meetings to give an update on the project and address any questions that the Urban Renewal Commission may have as it relates to the status of the project, as well as the requested amendments that are before you. So we do have Mr. Mooney and some of his consultant team here to give a brief presentation and an update on the project, and then open it up for questions and answers. We do have two kind of recommended actions that were held over from the last one that had to do with, there was an agreement to a request to extend the development agreement to a date certain. So we need to decide on what that date certain is. And then in that process, Mr. Mooney agreed that the money that's being reimbursed to him per the agreement, no other reimbursements would happen until all the preconditions, so 4 of the 11 preconditions are still outstanding, until all those preconditions were met. In between when that staff report went out, there was a request for the commission to consider paying the land use application, being able to reimburse Mr. Mooney, the developer, for the land use application that would be submitted for the detailed development plan. That is one of the reimbursable items identified in the DDA. And at that point, the detailed development plan would have come before the Urban Renewal Commission for their approval prior to submitting the land use application. So that's one thing that needs to be some direction to staff provided on. And then the second one was the amendment, the proposed amendment number 1, which would extend the time of the development agreement. So,
Mr. Conkle, could you state the value of the land use application or the expenses incurred by the city to date?
we estimated that the land use application, without having the package in front of us, was around $70,000. And I believe that we have expended, sorry, I know I put this in here somewhere.
I don't think the second part's necessary. You did an estimate on the value.
Okay.
The record might reflect that the mayor has joined the meeting.
Thank you. Let the record reflect that Mayor Holliday has joined the meeting.
Can I ask a question?
Question from Commissioner Lyle Smith.
Mr. City Manager, can you clarify, is the land use application reimbursement that you're asking for reimbursement to the city or reimbursement to
It would be
the
a
applicant?
reimbursement to the developer,
To the
the
developer.
applicant. So the developer is bringing the detailed development plan to the Urban Renewal Commission for their approval.
Right.
Once it's approved by the Urban Renewal Commission, it gets submitted through the city land use process on behalf of the Urban Renewal Commission.
That's what I thought.
Yes. If there are no other questions, I'd like to invite Mr. Mooney up.
Mr. Mooney would like to come forward, or his staff, please do.
You want me to, we got Paul Boundy with us tonight. He's the chief architect, and I think it would be useful if he showed sort of an overview of the project.
And would that include the PowerPoint that's?
PowerPoint, yeah.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we let him drive the PowerPoint? Please come forward, sir, and state your name.
So should I stay here?
Please.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you're gonna correct me if I'm wrong. Well, Paul Boundy, LRS Architects, thanks for having me here. You're gonna see, some of you have seen this before, some of you haven't. This is the the summary of the project for the Urban Renewal Agency that was presented in October of last year, November of last year as well. I'll go ahead and drive the PowerPoint. And as previous times, if you have any questions, let me know. The project is substantially unchanged from previous discussions and review of it. As we've kind of talked through before, the project is two phases. We're calling it their phase 2A and 2B. Phase 2A is 5 buildings that are all housing. There's a level of parking below the housing units. There's also surface parking. There are two central buildings that are towards the north end here that are, we call them A1 and A2 buildings. They are the ground floor of those buildings are the amenity space in A1, some commercial space, restaurant space, and they bookend a plaza access point to the Esplanade that comes from Agnes Avenue. To the south of those buildings, there are 2 buildings, we call them the B1 buildings, and those are 65-unit apartment buildings, 4 over 1, with a couple of the units in each of the buildings have a loft-type upper bedroom, so there are actually five floors in a very small area. And then towards the end of the street at the end of Agnes, the south end of Agnes, is the building D1, which has a combination, all of these have a combination of some live-work units. Sorry, the A buildings don't. The B and the D buildings have some live-work units on the ground floor that access to towards the public streets. Building D1 has also some amenity deck space that is shared by that building. A1 has swimming pool, the fitness center, meeting rooms, kind of general amenity for the entire complex. A2, as we mentioned, has some commercial space, the intent being a restaurant that overlooks the cove as well. And then the 3 north buildings in phase 2B are the repeat of the 2B1 buildings, 65 units, and then there's essentially a bookended D building at the north end that all of those have the live-work units on the ground floor as well. Parking is a combination of surface parking and underground parking. As we've mentioned, the underground parking is in the floodplain, was part of the plan. And the buildings are up and elevated. The living areas are all up and elevated outside of the floodplain. Some of the renderings we've produced to date, some of these have fairly accurate landscaping and some of them don't. This one probably doesn't, but gives you an idea of the scale of the buildings, the height of the floodplain in relation to Agnes and Main Street, right?
I'm actually more interested in what part of don't these represent what we're going to get that you care to tell us?
Well, I'm just
you'll
saying
find out.
they don't have all the landscape shown on this particular rendering. The comment there was in relation to the ones that our landscape architect has produced to the ones we've produced. So the next couple you'll see that a little better. And this one is produced by the landscape architect, where the plantings is shown a little more accurately
But the buildings are accurate?
The buildings are accurate, the window sizes are accurate, the siding for the most part is accurate.
So the shrubbery is the only thing we have to worry about?
Shrubberings,
Okay.
no, yeah. Yeah. No, the buildings themselves, you'll see a color scheme here in a minute. Some of these renderings are a little bit older than the current color scheme that we're proposing, which is kind of a blue and a gray trim color scheme, but the windows, the buildings themselves, the scale are all accurate. Okay. And this is looking at it along the Main Street, and you see the height difference, the wall. We've been working with the planning staff to work out that wall, the landscaping of the wall, kind of minimizing the impact. But between the floodplain and where the road is, there's no way to avoid that difference in height. There will be walkways along here, stairways down to grade to the Esplanade. Just to the left of this image, you've got the access point to the Esplanade. You can see it just beyond there, on to the left of this.
Question?
Yeah, I have one question. That
Sure.
is, let's say we have the 100-year flood
Yep.
at the 96 level. Are these people still going to be able to get in and out of their homes?
No, they will not be able to go in and out. The surrounding areas will all be flooded, I think.
Including the front parking lots?
The front parking lots are a little bit above the floodplain, I believe. I mean, depends on how bad it is and how, the access points to this are, I mean, we have to have a certain number of access points that are above the floodplain for emergency response, and that's what we have. But yeah.
Of taking that a step further, when it comes time, if that were to occur, how are we going to house all these people who are displaced in that type of event? We don't need a long discussion over. I mentioned it. Please move on.
Okay. The 2A buildings, this is a little more detail on the plaza that accesses the Esplanade from Agnes Avenue. You can see the amenity spaces and the fitness and the pool and the deck on the left side of the plan, and then the restaurant, retail, commercial spaces on the right side with the decks as well.
And that drawing is accurate for scale and content?
That drawing is accurate for scale and content. I can't say all the furniture is accurate, but.
Not worried about that.
Yeah, general concept, that is what we have in
All
our
right.
plans.
Can you, before you leave that, can you tell me, you have a restaurant shown there and some retail space. Whose job is it, or what is the effort that you're going to make? I mean, do you really plan to fill that space with those amenities, or is that totally optional and that's kind of what you'd like to have, but it may not happen at all?
I'll let David answer that one.
Are you talking about the restaurant?
The restaurant and the retail space, yes.
I think we'll be able to fill that space with this plan. Are you suggesting that what happens if it doesn't get full? It could stay empty, or it could
Yes.
be used for residential purposes
Right.
in the event that it doesn't rent. But I don't see a problem with this amount of retail. It's really, phase one has rental, but it's, and it hasn't had a good rent up. But it's nevertheless, takes a while to readjust people's habits to, you know, if there's a beauty salon in here, you know, you've got to, if it's a more convenient one for the 600 plus people that are going to be living here,
Right.
you know, it should be economic.
We understand that. I mean, the creation of demand comes from residents there.
Partly,
I think
yes.
part of the question is, you know, we saw the other development across the street, which had the vertical tax credit with provision for shops in the first floor. And at the time we were there, they were all unoccupied.
Yeah.
But we understand the sequence of events that must happen for them to be desirable to retail. Please proceed.
Another view of the plaza linking the Agnes Avenue to the Esplanade. There's the flagpoles, tree areas, and a little more urban nature than the planted areas at the other ends and on the Esplanade side of the building. So we're trying to bring in and integrate some water feature as well, some sort of fountain. The design of that is still a little undesignated. It's kind of plain shown here, but the intent is to be this focal point that runs between the Agnes Avenue side and the Esplanade.
Well, here's a tip. Don't let the trees lift your sidewalk.
Yeah. Agreed. Agreed.
Can you tell me, I see you have bike cages in your rendering. Are you planning to have bike garages in your underground parking space?
We do
where they're
have
locked and
some
protected?
spaces for bikes underneath, correct?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can't quote the city code requirement for that, but the intent is the residents would be able to have them down in the parking, hopefully not bringing them up into the units, but that's management, you know, that'll be a management decision when that time comes. The decks on the cove side, again, I'll just say the landscaping in this is not representative of the natural aim and goal of the landscaping in this rendering. That's kind of, so we'll make sure that's clear and understood. But it does show the size and scale of the Esplanade. It shows the stairs, the ramping up to the plaza level, and it shows the concept of that deck. We have since developed the deck a little further. We understand the railing a little better now, so this was kind of, that component of this is a little bit of early rendering. But the scale of the buildings, the size of the windows, the decks on the buildings, and the interaction between the plaza and the main space is accurate. I don't think we have the lawn bowling anymore. I think we have some barbecue pits and things like that out there instead with the current plan. That's a horrible rendering. A little darker view of that. This has got a little bit different view with with some planting, with the railings. Trying to figure out if there was a point to that one. It's just got a little different lighting. Sorry. This scheme is looking at that plaza from the other side. You can see the loft type units prominently placed on the sort of the brow of these buildings, bookending the plaza itself. And then a little more detail on the plaza. This is also rendered by the landscape, so you can see a little more accurate in terms of the plantings. The overall view of the scale of the project, this is showing phase A phase 2A and phase 2B of the project.
So talk a little bit about the view corridors from I-205. So are there enough in there that it's not going to just be a solid line of buildings and drivers or passengers will be able to see through there?
That's an interesting question because I'm not sure you can see this from 205 because of the berm.
Well, let's just say whether we can see it or not, we know it's there, and I'm glad that there's not a full line of buildings.
Right,
So
yeah.
there's some openings. What I was asking you to talk about is talking about the fact that there are openings.
Yeah, well, there are, correct. Yeah, we have 8 buildings. There's spacing between the buildings. And that kind of ties into what's potentially developing on the other side of Agnes because we don't know, we obviously don't own that property, don't know what's going to happen and how that's going to develop in the future. But certainly hoping to set up this precedent that, the access points to this project and that project will align. Whatever they do is kind of coordinated, whatever's happening on this site. But again, we don't have any control over that. So yeah, there are spaces between the buildings. They are oriented towards the cove, and so there are a lot longer access along the cove, but we do leave space between them to be able to have the view corridors through. I think there was a question in one of the previous meetings about the acoustical impacts of 205 as well, and that's something we've had since that point, had the acoustical study completed, making some that defines the type of windows that we're going to have on that side of the building, that defines potentially some additional insulation to reduce that noise and that impact to the residents of the apartments.
Because it is loud.
It can be.
Yep.
The color palette of the project is basically what you're seeing here, the materiality. There's base of the buildings that's kind of there's some of them are brick, some of them are stone veneer base, painted fiber cement lap siding. It's a very similar palette to what you see in phase 1. Stainless steel deck railings. The windows at the units are all black vinyl. And then the color scheme is is a blue, beige, warm, gray mix. And it's the next couples, you can kind of start to see a little more about how that color starts to define on the elevations in this next slide. With the storefront on the ground floor units where we have the live works, where we have the retail and commercial spaces, are going to be more of a commercial storefront. Above, their vinyl windows system, very traditional, operable windows. A little more detail there. See sort of the live work units on the bottom here, and then the more residential.
Paul, are they live work units or work live units? There's a difference.
They are, well, they're called live work units.
So they're built to a residential standard?
They're built to a residential standard with a room that is accessed from the public side that can be used as a storefront. And so it's either an office space or a CPA or it could be it's a wide range of uses.
The reason I ask is that, as you know, the work-live units are built to a commercial standard,
Right.
which means they can have the business there and the incidental use is living.
Right.
If it's a live-work standard, that means they can probably only have like a home occupation or something of that sort because it's not built to a commercial standard, therefore that might cause people problems.
Yeah, it is definitely more the live work unit.
So the main purpose of that is for them to live there and then incidentally they have a business?
Correct.
So let me ask that question. So if they're live work units and people, if somebody has a CPA office or maybe they have a t-shirt shop, something else, would that be prevented from being there?
No, not at all.
Well, I think it depends, that's gonna come down to your zoning, how the zoning views this type of unit.
Tony?
That
We'll
comes
worry
down.
about that later, but it's just, it's a distinction.
It's a distinction, but I think that's part of working through. One of the preconditions is for the vertical housing tax credit. There's specific requirements in the vertical housing in order to qualify for how the units need to be designed.
Okay.
And so really, if it's some manufacturing that's not going to comply with the
Right.
building code, right, versus a CPA
But
or
most
attorney,
basic retail or office would be okay there.
that's in our zoning it would be, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Some typical unit layouts here, just an idea of, we've started to work through the materiality of the units. There'll be vinyl flooring, which is very traditional throughout a lot of the apartments these days. Separate bathrooms. Most of the units have a bathroom or a bath and a half, depending on the size of the unit. The kitchens are all, for the most part, U-shaped kitchens. The 1-bedroom and 2 bedrooms that we see here will all have decks, patios, that they can access, and a window that is prominent in the living space and in the bedroom space. The live work, as you can see on the right here, is kind of a little better definition of that, where we've got the apartment. The left side of the plan is the work area, whether it's an office type of work area or, it's just flexible for an accountant or somebody, a massage therapist or counselor or tarot reader or something. And then on the right side here is the living part of it, which is a very traditional unit, can be separated off.
So the
private.
windows in the bedrooms, are they going to be operable?
We're required to have a certain amount of ventilation, and so there's always an operable piece to the
Okay.
windows.
And it's a height, the ceiling height.
Yeah, and the ground floor, the other distinction on the live work units on the ground floor and any of the ground floor retail spaces are the ceiling heights are 2 to 3 feet taller than those on the apartments above. And you also see a 3-bedroom unit here, which is typically on the ends or towards the ends of the units, the way the layout works. And I think that's the end of the slides. So are there any other questions?
Questions or comments on that presentation?
I assume you're guaranteeing the blue sky at all times, that way it doesn't look like it's
Blue Lagoon.
yeah.
I have one question.
Commissioner?
So to return to the flood issue, this may be more of a question for Mr. Conkle or maybe Ms. Turway. As part of the land use review process, could we consider putting, as part of the approval, having an evacuation plan and in place of how they alert their residences whenever there's an emergency, or like having that be proactive? I can't imagine we approve a lot of properties knowingly that they're in the floodplain and that they likely will have a flood risk. So I didn't know, is that standard, or is that something that Planning Commission could consider, or what?
I don't know that it's a requirement of compliance with the floodplain itself. Is really what we're looking at is balance, cut, and fill,
Right.
and making sure that all habitable space are 1 foot above the elevation.
The other thing about that is that we're talking about the 100-year floodplain, so we're talking about a 1996 level flood.
Sure.
And typically, most of our floods operate in the 30 to 50-year floodplain
Right.
rate. But the other thing about that is we always know we don't get flash floods here. We get turtle floods here, so we know 3, 4, 5 days in advance that
I know,
flood's coming.
which is why an alert system or at least a plan in place to alert the residents that
We're looking up. I can't remember if it's the building code that has the requirement or the planning code that has the requirement. But for example, some of the parking is going to be underground, so that there's going to be signage that this would be inundated. I
Right.
believe that there is some language in there about the evacuation route. I don't know about an exact plan per se.
Right.
But that's something that isn't really germane to this particular conversation, right? That is all
It
going
was
to
just a
happen.
question if it was part of the land use approval, and I don't.
Am I
recall it
correct
being.
in saying that those floods only occur for 3 or 4 days?
Yeah, typically 3, 4, yeah, 5 days to max.
So somebody has to get their car out of the garage.
They'll have plenty of time.
Yeah, and
Not always.
Well,
They sure did in 96.
I think more importantly, we'll have a significant number of displaced people that we have to find housing
Yes, you
for
will.
that 3 or 4 day period.
Yes, you will.
Anything further
I
from the
don't
commission?
necessarily agree with that, but I grew up in hurricane country in Florida, so we can discuss that later. I guess the point would be, it would be great for the residents that live there, knowing that you're building in a floodplain, just something to consider. Have an evacuation plan, and communicate with the residents of, how you're gonna distribute information and their best place to go. That would be really good.
And we can follow up with Clackamas Fire, because we do coordinate with them on some issues, and we can have that discussion, because, with the Edgewater, that, the one across the street that's constructed right now, we did construct an emergency access into the backside of the Oregon City Shopping Center for
Right.
access into that during that 100-year flood event when Main Street's inundated.
And as far as evacuation is concerned, the fire alarms in these facilities will be required to have voice evac ability. So the speakers in the hallways would be talking, saying, get out.
Yeah, I'm just trying to address some of the concerns of the commission, just some ways that we can be proactive.
Okay, thanks for the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have a number of key questions to answer. Do you want to summarize them? Those being the DDA itself, extension, and the question of what to do about the reimbursement of the land use application.
Correct. Those were the two. That staff recommends that the Urban Renewal Commission approve the reimbursement of the land use application fee as requested by the developer. We estimate that to be approximately plus or minus $70,000. So as I stated before, the detailed development plan for the specific design of the parking lot and the building will come before the Urban Renewal Commission. They'll review it, they'll approve it. At that point, that application, as amended or as submitted to the Urban Renewal Commission, if accepted, will then be submitted to the land use process. Once again, in the development agreement, any plans that are created, should this development agreement become null and void or the project doesn't move forward, become the property of the city. So there is some, I could understand how submitting a land use application on a property owned by the Urban Renewal District that's specifically identified for reimbursement in the DDA could be something easily justified for a reimbursement, but also being respectful to the commission wanted all of the preconditions met, of which this is one of the 4 that are outstanding, prior to any additional reimbursement of funds. So really, it's a policy discussion for the commission to decide how to move forward on that. And then the second issue had to deal with, we had some discussion, of how long to extend the DDA. Right now, the DDA expired on August 23rd. The commission has not sent the letter to begin the termination process. At this point, we are requesting in order to get through the financing component of this project, which includes through Bracadia's loan committee, preliminary pre-op application to Housing and Urban Development. That takes approximately 90 days by their own admission, so plus or minus 90 days on that, which comes back with an invitation to submit a firm application. That would be then addressed. Any conditions that came out of the pre-op from HUD, that would be resubmitted to HUD to get a final certificate. Once we get the final certificate, the firm commitment from HUD, at that point, we're gonna know all of the conditions to fund the loan, the $65 million loan or so. And at that point, we would be able to come back to the commission and say, they have demonstrated their loan commitment as well as their equity as identified in the DDA. So that's going to be probably the last thing in this process. And so in order to get through that, we are requesting some additional time. Looking at the calendar, we would have 2 meetings in May. The second one would be on May 20th. So that could be a date to push it out to. And then there was some discussion about potentially having some check-in earlier in February. We have a meeting on February 19th and on February 5th. So I think those are just some of the things that were discussed. So I've kind of summarized where we're at, and I will leave it to the commission to provide some recommendation.
If you would care to clarify what could potentially happen on February 19th if we did not receive the needed documents?
So there was, so discussion that on February 19th, we would have the ability to initiate the termination process as identified in the DDA.
Okay.
We would probably set it up the same way the termination process is set up in the DDA, with someone needing to take an initiative step to send the letter. And I think Mr. Mooney was agreeable to that timeline.
Do we want any further discussion on that, or do we want to forge a motion?
I'll make the motion.
Please do.
And could time out real quick.
Yeah, two motions, actually.
Two motions,
Let's
and I
do
guess
separately.
Yeah, I know.
can we do them separately, and then we're going to take the first one that relates to the funding, please, and because that's going to
Right.
And then can we get maybe a tentative approval? Because what I have before you tonight does not reflect any of this. So I'm going to, if we could get a tentative approval of what you'd like on the DDA for the timing and the reimbursement, because I'm going to have to rewrite amendment number 1.
Sure.
And then bring that, I could either bring that back or I could just incorporate that.
So
and move
let's
forward.
take that first. I would move that we tentatively approve the timeline that the manager has laid out for us on the DDA, and that he bring that back to us after he's got it all written down in the amendment, and we would then finalize that at that point.
I'll second it with a friendly amendment. I would prefer it be on February the 5th because I will be out of the country on February the 19th.
I'm okay with that.
Do not want to call in from parts unknown.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, as amended. We have a motion and a second. Call for the vote.
Commissioner Dan Holliday,
Aye.
Commissioner Rachel Lyle Smith. Aye. Commissioner Denise McGriff.
Aye.
Commissioner Rocky Smith.
No.
Commissioner Stephen Haberbeek.
Aye.
And Chair Frank O'Donnell.
Aye. Now let's deal with the question of the reimbursement of the land use application. I'm sorry, do you want
I'll just go ahead and make the motion that we authorize the city manager to reimburse the land use application and in the timing that he lays out for us.
I'll second it. It would be subject to the other things.
Requirements
Yes.
of needs to be applied for within 350 days. Would-
Yeah. Yeah.
All of those
Yes.
requirements would still be
Yes, put that in
applicable.
there, please.
Do we want any further discussion on that, or are we prepared to move forward?
Question.
Okay, call the question.
Call roll.
Commissioner Dan Holliday.
Aye.
Commissioner Rachel Lyle Smith.
Aye.
Commissioner Denise McGriff.
Aye.
Commissioner Rocky Smith.
No.
Commissioner Stephen Haberbeek.
Aye.
And Chair Frank O'Donnell.
No.
Okay.
All right, we settled those two matters. That was what was out in hand. Anything further? That being the case, we'll adjourn this meeting.
And we'll come back into regular session of the city commission at 7:35.